Chapter 3, Safire, age 15, November. "We don't like the library. It's boring," Selena of Bara said, indicating the high mahogany shelves with a graceful wave of her hand. Her sister Arabella nodded in solemn agreement. Selena looked just as I had always wanted to look, tall and slender with long black hair, large dark blue eyes, and a heart-shaped face, a heroine straight out of a Legat poem. I couldn't stand her. "A true lady never has time for idle reading," Dagmar said, and I glared at her back. "Traitor," I hissed under my breath. Mother had been a lady, and she had read for pleasure. Of course, Mother had been gone for over a year. Had it really been that long? So perhaps Dagmar had conveniently forgotten that Mother had been as likely to have a book in her hand as a sewing needle. She also seemed to have conveniently forgotten that Mother had been a witch. "What was that, Safire? You've been so quiet," Selena asked. "I must confess to a nasty habit for reading, but I do so hope that won't prevent us from being friends," I said, a grating false gaiety in my voice. Now Dagmar was the one glaring. The worst part, though, wasn't Dagmar's anger or Selena's simper. She didn't know how to handle rudeness, poor hothouse flower. But that I really had hoped we could be friends. I so longed for the companionship of other girls my age. But not these girls. Anyone who could look at this lovely library with its shelves and shelves of untouched, beautiful books and declare that she hated it would never be a friend of mine. God, that we could have a library like this. But Father would never be able to afford one, not if he stood on his head for a decade. The Barras were rich merchants and owned a whole fleet of ships. Of course they could afford to buy books they never opened, afford to have a library for nothing other than pretentious show. Envy tasted sour as unripe apples across my tongue, and my insides puckered. Envy, such a nasty emotion. After all, would I really want to leave home and live here just so I could be near the library? No, nothing, not even all the books in the world, would convince me to trade Father and Dagmar and our cozy home in the country for this family and their townhouse. They didn't even have a yard or a tree to call their own. Sad, really. I should pity them, not envy them. My head high, I sailed after the Bara girls when the dinner gong sounded. That was until Dagmar grabbed my arm and pulled me aside. "Mind yourself," she hissed. "Sometimes I think you go out of your way to be contrary, so no nice girls will be our friends. Do you really want to spend your whole life talking only to your horse?" "That's not true," I exclaimed, stung. "Why, Bolton and I talk all the time, and just last week, those vagabond girls and I walked down to the shore together. They were nice. I just wish they hadn't had to move on so soon. If Father hadn't chased their parents' caravan away." "You're hopeless. Do you even hear yourself? You just said your only friends are vagabonds and our ancient stable master, and you see nothing wrong with that?" "Bolton's not ancient. He still has all his teeth." She let go of my arm. "Just don't open your mouth during dinner, all right?" My head hanging, I trailed after her. I hadn't meant to ruin her chances to gain Selena and Arabella's friendship. Why was it that Dagmar and I got along so much better at home than out in public? I resolved then to be silent the rest of the evening, save for the standard pleasantries, a resolution I kept until I entered the banquet hall and set eyes on Selena and Arabella's brother, Peregrine. He was handsome, probably the handsomest man I'd ever seen outside of fairy tale illustrations. He had his sister Selena's coloring, but while her dark hair accentuated her delicate features, his emphasized his ungentlemanly tan, perfect white teeth, and square jaw, making him appear rather roguish. It didn't help that his lips curled in a sardonic satyr grin as he regarded us. At least 6 feet tall, with muscles straining the broad shoulders of his black velvet doublet, he towered over me as his elegant wisp of a mother Shanoa murmured introductions. I stepped back, out of his shadow, before he could grip my hand in his. I didn't want him touching me. I didn't want him anywhere near me. For not only was he the handsomest man I'd ever seen, he was also the only person I'd ever seen who didn't have a visible aura. I didn't know such a thing was possible. Everyone had an aura I could see, even if it was only a faint line of pale rose like Selina's. But not this Peregrine. What I could sense from him was the overwhelming earthy sweet scent of ambergris, to the point it was sickening. It smelled like someone had broken a cologne bottle over his head. My eyes watered, and I sank into the chair the liveried manservant pulled out for me, only to discover with horror that Peregrine's seat was right beside mine. He grabbed the napkin someone had carefully folded into a fan on his plate and shook it flat with a decisive snap of cloth. The odor of ambergris thick as smoke around me, I reached for my goblet, hoping the wine would wash away the smell. As Peregrine put his napkin on his lap, his hand brushed against my thigh under the table. A deliberate mistake on his part, as our chairs were at least 2 feet apart. I jumped at the unpleasant tingle of his touch and knocked over my wine goblet. The red stain spread with alarming speed across the pristine tablecloth, startling as blood drops marring the white snow during slaughter season. Arabella giggled, Selina tilted her perfect nose at a haughty angle, and Lady Shanoa ignored us all with politely murderous indifference, while Sir Levan, the Bara patriarch at the head of the table, just looked befuddled. The centerpiece, a huge silver urn with branches of autumn leaves and long curving strands of dried grasses, likely blocked his view of my misdeed. Both father and Dagmar stared me down, their eyes so hard that I focused my gaze on my plate as I mumbled an apology for my clumsiness. A manservant silently mopped up as much of the mess as he could, then refilled my goblet, setting it beside my plate with an accusing clink. To my relief, the servants brought out the first course then, a creamy onion soup. The men began discussing politics, and I pretended to be absorbed in my spoon, following its every dip with my eyes, mindful of every time it banged against the side of the bowl. The soup probably would have tasted far better without the cloying miasma of Peregrine's scent filling my nostrils, but I kept putting it in my mouth anyway and forcing myself to swallow. At least that would keep me from talking and embarrassing my family any more than I already had. Something father said caught my ear then. I hear His Majesty granted Halbert of Cassian a council seat. Yes. Halbert wouldn't be my first choice to fill that particular seat, but I'm certain King Arian has good reason for his decision that's beyond my limited understanding. Sir Levan's light blue aura surrounded him like a fine summer day, placidly benign. I glanced from him to his wife Shanoa, with her cloud-soft aura the color of coral, and wondered how these two had produced the bold, smelly Peregrine beside me. Then I realized that I had strayed from the safety of my soup, and I quickly cast my eyes downward again. A limited understanding? I thought you were high in the king's favor, father said, and I almost dropped my spoon. Could he be any less subtle? Poor father, he'd never get that council seat he coveted at this rate. Oh, no, Avernal, you rate my influence far too highly, Levan chuckled. I'm afraid I'm just a simple merchant who's happened to have a bit of luck. Perhaps Sir Avenel has a point, father, Peregrine remarked with silky smoothness. Obviously, by his measure, you have what it takes to be high at court. Why not press your position a bit more with King Arian, or with the other council members, at least the ones who owe you coin? Really, Peregrine, a well-born man never presses his debtors in such a fashion, you know that. Levan chuckled again, acting like his son had just uttered an amusing, if slightly risque, jest. But I doubted Peregrine had meant it as a jest. The men continued talking about the house of Cassian, and I lost interest. Even though I was supposed to be watching my soup, I couldn't help a glance at Dagmar. We exchanged rueful looks. We had discussed father's desire for a council seat the other night. We both wished he wouldn't try to be a courtier and just stay a gentleman farmer. He was good with crops, not politics. Although he would never admit it, I was certain his sudden obsession with the king's council had to do with securing good matches for me and Dagmar before he joined mother in the afterlife. He thought he needed to be on the council to protect us, just like this dinner tonight. He and Levan of Bara had nothing in common, no reason to be friends except that father thought Levan had the wealth and influence to help him in his quest. So why would Levan, who seemed a savvy sort in his mild-mannered way, have granted a dinner invitation for all of us? The sudden question made me lower my spoon as I gulped. He could have just had Father over for a drink and smoke in his study. Why did Dagmar and I need to be here? The obvious answers stared me in the face for a long moment before I could overcome my horror enough to allow it in my conscious mind. But surely Father couldn't mean to betroth Dagmar to Peregrine. She was 18 now, old enough to marry, but Peregrine? He was handsome, to be sure, but anyone with a witch's eye could see he was a bad sort. What kind of man didn't have a visible aura, and he had tried to grope my leg? I swiveled my face in his direction just to see if I had made a mistake somehow and missed his aura before. My spoon fell in the bowl with a clatter. He still didn't have an aura. He was watching me, not blinking, one elbow resting on the table, his chin propped against his palm. When he caught my gaze, he offered a smirk, one black eyebrow quirked as his tongue flicked over his bottom lip, serpent-like. Disgusting swine. I shuddered and turned back to my soup, only to discover that I could no longer use it as an excuse to look away, for I had eaten it all. Surely they would bring out the next course soon so I could stare at that instead of my dinner companions. "So, Safire," Peregrine said, forcing me to look his way again or risk appearing rude. "Yes," I said with as much primness as I could muster. Like Selina, his eyes were that arresting sapphire blue, a beautiful color wasted on this brute. A hero's eyes, when he deserved eyes the color of greasy dishwater. "What did you think of our library?" he asked, surprising me. I hadn't expected a leg groper like him to know books existed. I had expected he would share his sister's disdain for the printed word. "Rather extensive, except I didn't see any Sirach," I blurted out, so nervous that I said the first thing that popped in my mind. I just wanted him to leave me alone. A silence descended on the table. No one spoke, no cutlery hit the dishes, no coughs or sighs. Nothing for a full minute. My face felt on fire. "Did you say Sirach, my dear?" Shanoa's voice held a chilly note, the sound of sleet lashing glass. "I believe she did, Mother. I would hardly have expected such an—" Peregrine paused, winked at me. "An extensive education for a young woman, even one noble-born." "Who's Sirach?" Selina asked. "All we've ever studied is that dull legat." "Safire, since you seem to appreciate his verse so much, why don't you tell her who Sirach is?" Peregrine was enjoying himself immensely. "Peregrine, don't encourage her," Shanoa snapped, her aura flaring red for an instant. "Remember, you're a gentleman and the son of a gentleman. Although I appreciate your wit, my treasure, there are some subjects we do not discuss at the dinner table." "Sorry, Mother," he murmured. My treasure? Had she really called him my treasure? This strapping pirate, he had to be at least 18, far too old for nursery endearments. How revolting. Maybe she was being sarcastic. But one look at her dainty frown, her icy gaze, her upturned nose, and I was convinced this woman didn't have a wry bone in her body. I so wanted to leave. Then I caught Dagmar's and Father's glares and realized that as bad as this dinner was, the long ride home was going to be even worse. I'd just have to tell them how rude Peregrine had been. After all, they hadn't seen him touch my leg. Once I told Father that, I was sure whatever betrothal hopes he had concerning Peregrine would suffer a quick death. "Sweet, you're mistaken. I'm sure the man didn't mean to touch you like that." Father paced between his desk and the door of the study, his remaining strands of hair sticking straight up on his head as he scratched at his scalp. "I mean, I've touched people by accident at the table before when I've put my napkin on my lap." "Father, there was at least 2 feet between my chair and his. You can't tell me he had to reach out that far to place his napkin properly." "Maybe he dropped something and was reaching for that," Dagmar suggested. Now free to glare back as much as I liked, I glowered in her direction. "Why don't either of you believe me?" I demanded. Father sighed and sat down in his chair. "Safire, I believe that you believe Peregrine acted in an untoward fashion towards you. Whatever your other faults, I know you wouldn't deliberately lie to us, but I also know you're mistaken. The man's a gentleman. He wouldn't manhandle a young girl, a guest at his father's table, no less. But he did. I covered my eyes with my hand. My throat felt raw from explaining myself and protesting my innocence when I had thought they would believe me without question. All right, you didn't see him touch me, but you did hear him, how he used his words to trap me into embarrassing myself? Is that the action of a gentleman? I heard nothing of the sort. I heard him trying to make polite conversation with you and you making a rude comment about their library not being big enough, a comment which I might add insulted the lady of the house. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, a fish out of water. Father still didn't understand who Sirach was. He thought that Shanoa had taken offense at my comment, not because I had mentioned Sirach, which was apparently a huge faux pas in polite society, but because I had somehow insulted the size of their library. Oh dear. If I explained Sirach to Father, he would realize why Shanoa hadn't liked what I said and take away my beloved books. No, best let him think that my comment had merely been an insult about the breadth of the Bara book collection. I wilted in my seat, realizing that I was defeated. At least we would never visit those people again. My clumsy insolence had spared me that much. Little did I know that the worst was yet to come. Now, what you'll do tomorrow first thing is write a letter of apology to Shanoa of Bara. Yes, Father. Keep in mind the punishment would be much harsher, but I'm feeling generous. Despite your terrible display, I'm sure you'll be happy to hear that Peregrine enjoyed your spirit, as he called it, and asked if he could call here next Monday afternoon. My mouth dropped open, and I gaped at him, aghast, for at least a moment before I stuttered, but I could form no other words. My mind was as blank as a field the morning after a heavy snowfall. I finally managed to breathe, then exhale, my pent-up shock coming out in a rush. But he has no aura. Dagmar shook her head, her arms folded across her chest. Did you say aura? Safire, what are you talking about now? It's this light around people. Mother saw them too, something which is... I trailed off. Father's face reddened, and he leapt to his feet. Safire! His voice was a strangled hiss, the sort of sound I might expect from a dragon's throat. Safire, never say that word again, especially in the same breath as you mention your sainted mother. Do you understand me? Well, do you? His grip bruised my shoulders as his bloodshot eyes drilled into mine. Father, I whimpered, please, I didn't mean... Dagmar rose and reached out to grasp his arm. Father, she was just answering my question. You should be berating me for asking it, not her. Now, sit down before you have a fit. Her calm, reasonable tone, so like Mother's, seemed to reach him, for he let go of my shoulders. His hands shaking, he tousled my hair before he turned away. He sank down on his chair and buried his face in his hands. You don't understand. Neither of you, not really. You've never witnessed a burning, but I have. Your mother had too. Most horrendous thing I've ever seen. The thought of either one of you witnessing something like that, much less being the one... He fumbled for words, choking. The one at the stake. God, I can't stand it. His shoulders jerked, his aura a jagged-edged flame that scorched the air into dark smoke around him. I glanced at Dagmar to find her looking at me, her hands limp at her sides, both of us at a loss. Seeing him broken down and in such a state, no mother here to soothe his upset, made me feel a small child again, orphaned and abandoned in a dark wilderness of adult emotion. What did one do when one was lost? One called for mother and father, then listened for their answers. Since father was in no condition to answer, I listened for mother. What would she have done? I pictured her laying her hands upon his shoulders and drawing away the tension in his muscles so he could breathe properly again. Before I was conscious of my own movement, I stood and crossed the room. I found myself standing behind him. I circled his shoulders lightly with my hands and closed my eyes. He made some slight sound, perhaps a protest. Then silence filled my ears with the roar of emptiness. the faint, constant howl of eternity inside the chambered nautilus I had found on the seashore last summer, and I heard nothing beyond myself. A knotted and tangled black rope appeared on the backs of my eyelids. I untied each knot, undid each tangle, then coiled the rope in a neat spiral, the shape of the chambered nautilus. When I finally let go of the end, the rope vanished, and I opened my eyes. Father exhaled with a gusty sigh, his shoulders drooping. His hands fell from his face to his lap. Then slowly he lifted one hand and reached back to pat my arm. "That's enough, Safire. That's enough, sweet," he muttered. "Whatever are we to do with you?" I swallowed over the dry patch in my throat, still half in a witch trance as I stumbled back to my seat. Dagmar grabbed my arm and guided me down to the chair. "What's to be done with me, Father? What do you mean by that?" I heard myself ask. My words slurred as if I had no sleep for several days. Mother had warned that healings would exhaust me, especially before I grew fully into my power. Experienced healers learn to use only the strength required, no more, and I was far from experienced. "What do you mean by that?" I repeated when he didn't respond. He clasped his fingers in a double fist and stared down for what seemed like ages before he answered. "I don't know exactly, Safire. I just want to protect you, and after tonight's display, I think the best way to do that is to keep you at home until you're older and have learned some discretion. You're too impulsive, sweet. I worry the next time you open your mouth at a fancy dinner, you'll start talking about auras or spirits and we'll all end at the stake." I straightened and clutched my arms across my chest, indignation chasing away my exhaustion. "Father, I would never do that. I can't believe you think I would jeopardize you and Dagmar." "I know you wouldn't intend to," he said heavily. "Just like you didn't intend to insult Lady Shanoa tonight. But you did, and I can't risk you doing it again at a noble dinner or ball when your hasty tongue could land you not only in hot water, but burned as a—" He paused, struggled with the word. "Witch," he managed finally. "So you're going to keep me here like a prisoner? How will I ever learn to be out in society unless I'm around people?" "Don't put words in my mouth, Safire. I didn't say I was going to lock you away here. You can go out to Calcor's with Dagmar. You'll keep an eye on her, won't you?" This he addressed to Dagmar. Her head bobbed in a quick nod. "Yes, Father." "Good. I know you'll be sensible." He turned back to me. "Now you follow your sister's example. Unlike those from our own station, the market merchants and peasants in Calcor's aren't likely to ascribe witchcraft to a noblewoman's oddities. But you still need to be prudent. If you can learn to mind yourself in Calcor's, and you mind yourself when Peregrine visits, I'll reconsider allowing you to attend dinners and balls with the local nobility. I want to be able to present both you girls at court someday." "Mind myself when Peregrine visits? But, Father—" He waggled his index finger at me. "No buts, Safire. You want to end in a convent?" He was always threatening me with the convent. For the first time since I could remember, it sounded appealing. I doubted the walled virgins would let Peregrine visit me, no matter how much coin and bought respectability he had. I had just nestled under the bedclothes with a volume of Legat's mermaid poems when there came a tap at the door. Dagmar padded into the chamber, her hand a huge shadow moth gliding across the wall as she shielded her candle from drafts. I silently moved over in the bed so she could climb under the covers to keep warm. Despite the banked fire in the grate, my chamber was cold. I sometimes wondered if spirits visited me at night and added to the chill. Odd voices and visions often disturbed my sleep with vivid dreams. In my last one, I had perched on the top of the sea cliffs by the ancient twisted cedar tree that marked the path down to where the best caves would be found. Stars sparkled, diamonds scattered across a blue-black velvet sky, while hundreds of flames floated like visible prayers on the waves far below. A tide of little lights coming in just for me. Suddenly, I heard men chanting. A procession of cloaked forms walked along the edge of the cliffs toward me, carrying torches. The man at the front cradled a crying, naked babe in the crook of his arm. They didn't seem to see me as they strode down the path carved into the cliff face below the cedar tree. I rose and crept after them. When they reached the shore at the base of the cliffs, they formed a circle. The rush of waves, the baby's cry, and the men's chant mingled until I could not tell the sounds apart. The flames still bobbed on the water. Infant souls rocked on the lap of the mother sea. The man with the baby broke from the circle and strode to the edge of the water. He bent down and gently laid the struggling girl child on the waves amidst the flames. As soon as she felt the water on her skin, her crying stopped. She floated on the sea and stared up at the sky, constellations reflected in her eyes. And I knew then she was my mother's spirit, visiting me in my sleep to tell me all was well. "Safire, did you hear me?" Dagmar's voice broke into my reverie. I shook myself, the Legat book slipping from my hand as I turned to look at her. "Sorry, what?" Dagmar pursed her lips. "You know, half the time you look through me as if I'm not there, and I have to say everything twice because you never hear me the first time. Where do you go?" I shrugged. "I was remembering a dream I had, that's all." "No wonder Father is worried that people will think you a witch." I twisted the sheet between my hands. "I can't help that I have these dark talents, you know. No more than you can help being so sensible." She did something unexpected then. She slid her arm around my shoulders and hugged me close. "Father didn't mean to be so harsh with you. He just gets like that when he's afraid. He's afraid for us. He's afraid that if something happens to him before he can arrange good marriages for us, we'll have no protection from witch hunters and unscrupulous men." "I know that. But Dagmar, that Peregrine is unscrupulous. How can Father allow him to call on me?" "There, there." She patted my shoulder and I winced. I had a bruise there where Father had gripped me earlier. "Why do you say Peregrine's unscrupulous? You've only just met him, Safire. How can you know that?" "Anyone who wears that much cologne has something rotten to cover up. That's how." She let go of me and drew back, her brow furrowed in apparent puzzlement as she regarded me. I didn't smell any cologne on him. It was my turn to be puzzled. "How could you not? He was drenched in the stuff. It smelled like he used the whole bottle. Ambergris, too. I bet that cost him a pretty copper. All I smelled was sandalwood soap and a hint of pipeweed. Well, I wasn't sitting next to him. Perhaps that's why I didn't smell it." "Perhaps," I murmured, and glanced down at my fingers, still worrying the sheet into crumples. There was no way Dagmar could have missed the cologne, if that was what it had been. She had a sensitive nose. Since only I had smelled it, likely it had been his invisible aura that stank so strongly. I wished Mother were here. If the ambergris was Peregrine's aura, she would have smelled it too, and perhaps convinced Father that he shouldn't let Peregrine call on me. "He was certainly handsome," Dagmar said slyly. "I wish I had such a handsome suitor. And rich, too. He stands to inherit the bulk of his father's wealth. Father says he's very clever, and you've always wanted someone clever you could talk to about books." "Nothing you say is going to make me like him, Dagmar." "Well, he certainly liked you. He couldn't stop looking at you, even though you would hardly look at him." I shuddered. "Really? That's sinister. I'm glad I kept my eyes on my plate then. You're telling me that you didn't think once about how handsome he is?" I pushed her, half in jest. "If you want him so much, you can have him, although I can't even stand the thought of him as a brother-in-law, much less a husband." Her hand curled around my wrist as her smile faded, replaced by straight-lipped sternness. She suddenly looked 5 years older, at least. "Listen, sister, I don't want to worry you or make you see someone you find distasteful, but please give Peregrine a second chance. He's young and handsome and charming." "Charming on the outside, perhaps," I interrupted. Her grip tightened. "Just let me finish. You could make far worse matches than him. Could you imagine being married off to a man Bolton's age?" "Father wouldn't do that to us." "Sweet, he may not have a choice. If his health fails, or we have another bad year with the wheat harvest, or a flood, or any number of calamities, we'll have even less than we do now to bargain with on the marriage market." "I'm going to marry for love," I declared. She smiled, A sad smile. You and your poetry and your romance. I hope you find it, Safire, but in the meantime, be nice to Peregrine. There are far worse fates for a sparrow noblewoman than a handsome husband who wears too much cologne. I hated it when she acted so much wiser than me. She was only the elder by 2 years. What about you? I asked, defiant. Don't you want to marry for love? I want to marry into the house of Landers, she said, completely serious. Why? Are you in love with the Landers? I was aghast. My level-headed sister had a secret beau? No, silly, she swatted me. I don't know any of them, yet. It's just one of the highest houses at court, and I want to marry into a high house. And father thinks he has a chance to arrange something with them. Apparently Sir Mordred is interested in our lands. It sounds so dry and prosaic when you say it like that, I sighed. I suppose if that's what makes you happy. What makes me happy is security and knowing what's expected of me. I pray every night my future husband will be a good man and love will follow. Love will follow? Follow what? I wanted to ask, but I didn't. She made love sound like the answer to an addition problem. Good man plus good name plus security equaled love. Where was passion? Where was poetry? It seemed to me she had left some essential factors out of her equation. Of course, maybe I just didn't understand. After all, aside from geometry, arithmetic never had been my strongest subject. I studied the pale sunlight slanting through the schoolroom windows as I listened with half an ear to Lawrence reading from some boring history. I enjoyed writers who told history like a story, with all the fascinating personality quirks and schemes of the heroes and villains on display, rather than some dry recitation of dates and events. Unfortunately, Lawrence took a dim view of what he called literary license with the facts, and so found the driest history books he could, which invariably put me to sleep and earned me a sharp rap on the head. Today, though, the light fascinated me, so I managed to stay awake. I wondered why the light looked so different in late fall and winter than it did the rest of the year. Was it because of the cold? Perhaps the same fey folk who put frost paintings on our windows at night silvered the light during the day. Lawrence's liquid voice rose and fell as if he sang a chant. The beauty of the sound so captivated me that it took me a moment to actually hear the words he read. The old ones carved a path into the sea cliffs of Silmer province, marked at the head by an ancient cedar tree. The provincial guild of road builders maintain the path to this day, as it is one of the few ready accesses to the beach in the area of the cliffs. It is impossible to determine the age of the path. However, it is possible to determine its original purpose from legend and knowledge of the Old Ones' savage temperament. It is said that the Old Ones took their firstborn down to the caves at the base of the path and left the babes there to drown as a sacrifice to the sea gods. "No!" I exclaimed, then hunkered down in my seat when Lawrence stopped and regarded me, his thin brows raised. "It is horrifying, Lady Safire, I agree. Hardly surprising, however. The Old Ones were a primitive people, heathen savages who tried to slaughter our ancestors." He turned his gaze back to the book, poised to start reading again. "I don't believe it." Oh dear, there went my big mouth again. I just couldn't reconcile my dream vision of the Old Ones with the awful picture of infant sacrifice the history book painted. "Are you questioning the court historian?" Lawrence's tone was dry, very dry indeed. "Yes." I met his pale gaze defiantly. "After all, we won the battles against the Old Ones. To them, we were the invaders. None of them got a chance to write the histories." "That's because they could neither read nor write," he said crisply. "But then how do we know they sacrificed their babies if no one wrote anything down about it?" Lawrence slapped the book down on the table, and Dagmar jumped beside me at the sound. "Lady Safire, your questions are argumentative and presumptuous. I normally find you a pleasant pupil, but you seem in a most disagreeable mood today. Please leave and return only when you can listen instead of talk." I flounced out, muttering under my breath. How dare he dismiss me like that? All I had done was ask some perfectly logical questions. He was the one who had picked that deadly, dull, horrid book to read, not me. He was the one in a disagreeable mood, not me. One would think he had written the history himself with how protective he was of it. I paused outside my chamber door, suddenly wondering. It was odd that the normally mild-mannered Lawrence had flown into such a fit. Perhaps my questions had touched on some forbidden topic, like the time I had asked what Father meant by his remark that Lawrence had reformed from chastity. Whatever the reason, I knew I was in trouble yet again. When Father returned from Calcours later this afternoon, Lawrence would certainly tell him that I had made a scene in the schoolroom. Now that I had defended them and gotten into trouble for them, I was even more enthralled with the old ones and their path marked by the cedar tree. I got out my sketchboard and charcoals. Then I sat cross-legged, my back propped against the trunk, the board on my knees. The tension buzzing inside from my argument with Lawrence thrummed through my veins, into my fingers, through the charcoal stick, and zigzagged out onto the paper as I drew the jagged edges of the cliffs and path. By the time I started on the softer shapes of the dark-cloaked figures, the angry bees had stopped their buzzing, and the mellow honey flowed inside, a golden flood of contentment. I forgot Lawrence. I forgot that I was in trouble. I forgot everything except the charcoal stick in my hand and the vision forming into reality on the page before me. Pounding on the door roused me from my creative reverie. I had no time to hide my sketch or charcoals before Father burst into the chamber, florid-faced and panting. I quaked inside. First that disastrous dinner at the house of Bara, then my quarrel with Lawrence, now Father catching me doing the one thing I had never wanted him to catch me doing. This really was turning into the most wretched week. Father and I stared at each other for a silent moment before he made a quick sweep through the air with his hand. "What's this?" he demanded. "Charcoals, a sketchboard, paper, me using all three," I said in my smallest voice. "Where did you get it? If you spent your allowance on this, Mother bought it for me about a month before she died." This news deflated him to the point that he went over and sank down on the bed, the ropes protesting at his weight. He sat there, his face in his hands, his breath a loud wheezing. "Papa?" I ventured finally. He slid his hands down his face just enough so he could look at me, his fingers still covering his nose and mouth. "So you've been drawing in secret for over a year." His hoarse voice dropped on the word drawing, as if it were a mortal sin. "And your mother encouraged it." I nodded. "She liked a sketch I did of Paddington on my slate." He held up his hand and I trailed off. "There are worse things, I suppose, such as insulting the house of Bara, such as arguing with your tutor. Safire, you're impossible." "I don't mean to be." "I know, sweet, I know," he sighed. "God, I wish your mother was still here. She could talk to you better than I can. But she's not." For an instant, his face crumpled before he straightened his hunched shoulders and continued, his voice determinedly brisk. "I don't like your drawing. I don't think it's ladylike. But if she bought you those things, then she must have had a good reason. I won't forbid you to do it. Just keep it in here, where other people won't see you doing it, all right?" "Yes, Father." "If I find out you've broken your word, I'll take the board and drawing things away." "Yes, Father." "And tomorrow you'll apologize to Lawrence." I nodded as I bit my tongue, not trusting myself to speak. I didn't think I should have to apologize to Lawrence, but it wasn't worth an argument with Father. I wanted this to be the last time I upset Father. It seemed I was always upsetting him these days. Dagmar never upset him. Life would be so much easier if I were more like her.